Hi, everyone. My name is Keim-Malpass, and I'm coming to y'all today with another learning short focused on dissemination and implementation. Today, we're going to go over just a few of the more common implementation frameworks. This is not meant to be completely in-depth, but just a place to get started if you're interested in learning more about the existing frameworks. Today, we're going to be talking about a SWOT analysis, RE-AIM, PRACES2, and CFIR. CFIR stands for the Consolidated Framework of Implementation Research. These are just, again, the more common ones that I've encountered. There are certainly more than this out there. And before we even get started, I think it's important to know or think about, why do you want to use an implementation framework? An implementation framework can really help guide the underlying methodologies of your implementation-focused endeavor, and it can really help think about and articulate and explicate some of the factors that are either barriers or facilitators to long-term implementation and success. The other thing I want to mention is that there's a lot of different types of research where implementation science can occur. There can be purely pragmatic clinical trials, so clinical trials that are focused really on real-world context. There could be solely implementation-focused research where we're studying different ways of implementing and sustaining an intervention. And there also are hybrid trials that kind of bridge the gap between the two. We'll talk more about that in another learning short, but today we're just going to be talking about the underlying frameworks. So I'm going to start with a SWOT analysis first. A SWOT analysis certainly is not specific to healthcare, nor is it specific to implementation research. But I do think it's a helpful exercise to get folks started in thinking about implementation from the beginning. And so when we think about implementation, we're thinking about, some kind of intervention that we know to have some kind of preliminary efficacy, or a clinical guideline or a practice-based standard that has, is kind of built on an evidence basis. And we're thinking about implementing it either in a health system, in a community, wherever, our population exists. And so a SWOT analysis just helps us think about the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of implementing this type of work. It's meant to be done along with, members of the research team, but also key stakeholders and certainly members of the community that we are thinking about implementing in. So anyway, it's just a very approachable way to start thinking about some of these aspects. RE-AIM stands for Reach, Effectiveness, Adoption, Implementation, and Maintenance. And again, it's a very approachable implementation framework because the questions it asks are broad and should be things that we are thinking about from the onset. And so this is just an overview of the elements of the RE-AIM framework. You can imagine that within each element, there's different methodological ways to kind of tackle those questions in a very kind of bi-directional approach. But again, a lot of the focus is focused on how do we get this out there, and certainly how do we sustain and maintain adoption for long-term integration in care delivery. So again, it's just a very approachable framework to start thinking about these things, and you can imagine operationalizing some of the variables and methods which within each element. PRACES2 is a framework that I've certainly used before in the context of pragmatic clinical trials. It's a really nice one. So what we're looking at here are the different kind of spokes of a research study. So when we think about a research study, we're thinking about the outcome, the analysis, eligibility, all of the things that are in the traditional kind of clinical research life cycle. Explanatory trials, or the ones in the green, are what we consider more traditional clinical trials, where we are trying to control as much as we can to really understand the underlying efficacy of an intervention. Pragmatic clinical trials are all about effectiveness, and effectiveness is how well does this intervention work in real life context, which is a different question than the underlying efficacy. They're related, but they're very, very different. It's how well does it work in the population that I hope to integrate it within. And so I like PRACES 2 a lot because, again, you can kind of visualize, it gives you a scale, it's very operationalized. You can visualize the difference in a pragmatic trial versus a more explanatory trial, and perhaps where explanatory trials could get more pragmatic and vice versa. Again, it's very kind of quantitative driven and fairly straightforward to operationalize. This again rests on this notion that key stakeholders should be involved at every stage of trial design, even in the early stage creation. So finally, we have CFIR, and again, here is where you can get more information. CFIR is one that has gotten probably more commonly used in recent years. It's a little bit more complicated, I will say, than the other two that we focused on, but I really like it because it focuses on kind of the individual, what they call the inner setting that the individual is situated in, and then the outer setting. And the outer setting is really more broadly focused on some of the societal contexts and how they interface with one another. This is very similar to those that do, any kind of translational research. It's very similar to the socio-ecological model. So again, it resonates. If you use a socio-ecological model, it resonates with you because it is structured in a similar process. So it's a very process-oriented framework. It goes through the different roles that people in the studies and implementation context have. It elucidates the barriers and facilitators. It really focuses on the underlying processes and focuses on what they call some of the innovation implementation context, which again kind of extends what we've seen to really focus on the innovation context and how that comes up in the implementation frameworks. So again, I have started using CFIR. Again, it is a little bit more nuanced, which works for some projects and might be, overwhelming for some others. So I think it's a good one to build towards, particularly if you have any kind of background in implementation work. So with that, we have gone over different implementation frameworks, really starting with a SWOT analysis, which is a great place to start. We touched on REAIM, PRACES 2, and CFIR. They kind of grow in complexity as they go on. So I hope you see that. These, again, are not the only ones that exist out there. But give you a good kind of overview of how do these frameworks, how could they help in thinking about implementation science work. We will focus on underlying methodologies in the next learning short and look forward to connecting. Thanks so much.